Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, reporting on the worst junk science in 2,000 years. The always reliable Guardian put out this article last week. Climate Crisis, Recent European Droughts Worst in 2,000 Years. Study of tree rings dating back to Roman Empire concludes weather since 2014 has been extraordinary. The series of severe droughts and heat waves in Europe since 2014 is the most extreme for more than 2,000 years, research suggests. The study analyzed tree rings dating back as far as the Roman Empire to create the longest such record to date. The scientists said global heating was the most probable cause of the recent rise in extreme heat. But it's unfortunate that Guardian writers don't actually read their own newspaper. This article from The Observer, which is the Guardian's magazine, was published on July 18, 1852. Statistics of hot summers. The excessive heat which prevails at present, says a Paris paper, gives some interest to the following account of remarkably hot summers. In 1132 the earth opened, and the rivers and springs disappeared in Alsace. The Rhine was dried up. In 1152 the heat was so great that eggs were cooked in the sand. In 1160, at the Battle of Bella, a great number of soldiers died from the heat. In 1276 and 1277, in France, there was an absolute failure of the crops of grass and oats. In 1303 and 1304, the Seine, Loire, the Rhine, and the Danube were passed over dry-footed. In 1393 and 1394, great numbers of animals fell dead, and the crops were scorched up. In 1440, the heat was excessive. In 1538, 1539, 1540, 1541, the rivers were almost entirely dried up. In 1556, there was a great drought all over Europe. In 1615 and 1616, the heat was overwhelming in France, Italy, and the Netherlands. In 1646, there were 58 consecutive days of excessive heat. In 1678, excessive heat. The same was the case the first 3 years of the 18th century. In 1718, it did not rain once from the month of April to the month of October. The crops were burnt up, the rivers were dried up, and the theaters were closed by decree of the Lieutenant of Police. I'm not going to recite the rest of this article, but it has lots of examples going right up through 1850. And if Guardian writers don't trust their own newspaper, here's another article from the American Medical Journal in 1884. Hot weather. Many a man has mopped his brow during the summer months of 1884, declaring it was the hottest weather the world ever knew, which of course would not be true, for the extreme heat in the record of the past has not been approached during the late summer. In 627, the heat was so great in France and Germany, says the London Standard, that all springs dried up. Water became so scarce that many people died of thirst. In 879, work in the field had to be given up. Agricultural laborers persisting in their work were struck down in a few minutes, so powerful was the sun. In 993, the sun's rays were so fierce that vegetation burned up as under the action of fire. In 1000, rivers ran dry under the protracted heat. The fish were left dry and putrefied in a few hours. Men and animals venturing in the sun in the summer of 1022 fell down dying. In 1132, not only did the rivers dry up, but the ground cracked and became baked to the hardness of stone. Here's another article from 1901 which described very similar things, and they say that in 1821, 200 years ago, a plague of mice came with intolerable heat. More than 200,000 persons died from the heat in France. Here's another article from 1906. In 1809, so fearfully hot was it in Spain that the streets of Madrid and other cities were deserted, while laborers expired in the fields and the vines were scorched and spoiled. The summer of 1772 was a dreadful one in New York, and it is related that the principal thoroughfares resembled battlefields in miniature. People were struck down by the score, no fewer than 155 cases of sunstroke occurring on July 4th, of whom nearly one-half died. The following year in France, the thermometer rose to 118 degrees Fahrenheit. France also experienced two periods of great heat in 1705 and 1718. In the former year, it was described as being equal to that of a glass furnace. Meat could be prepared for the table merely by exposing it to the rays of the sun. In 1911, there was a 70-day-long heat wave in Europe, which killed more than 40,000 people in Paris. London reached 100 degrees on August 9, 1911, and people were dying in the streets. More than 1,000 people died in Germany during the heat wave of 1911. The United States also had some of its worst heat waves in 1911, including one in May. The Sydney Morning Herald reported on May 22, 1911, the terrific heat wave that is sweeping over the United States has been responsible for hundreds of deaths. And July 4th of 1911 was the hottest on record in the United States. During 11 hellish days, horses dropped in the street and babies didn't wake up from their naps. Boats in Providence Harbor oozed pitch and began to take on water. Tar in the streets bubbled like hot syrup. Trees shed their leaves, grass turned to dust, and cow's milk started to dry up. In every major northeastern city, the sweltering heat drove people to suicide. On July 4th, temperatures hit 103 in Portland, 104 in Boston, 105 in Vernon, Vermont, and 106 in Nashua, New Hampshire, and Bangor, Maine. At least 200 people died from drowning trying to cool off in rivers, lakes, ponds, and the ocean, anything wet. Still more died from heat stroke. The 1911 heat wave was possibly the worst weather disaster in New England's history, with estimates of the death toll as high as 2,000. In 1930, it was 100 degrees in Paris, and the hottest parts of France reached 122 degrees Fahrenheit, or 50 degrees Celsius. In 1935, the New York Times reported that Spain reached 127 degrees Fahrenheit, or 53 degrees Celsius. 1934 was the hottest year on record in the United States, and there was also a worldwide drought. It was described as England's worst drought for 100 or 180 years. But instead of trying to learn about and understand the climate of the past, what journalists and climate scientists generally do is simply bury it. The Guardian pulls the same scam over and over again. 9 years ago, they announced that drought may be the new norm for the UK, and then they had some of the worst flooding on record a few weeks later. The people pushing this propaganda are not journalists and they're not scientists. They are people with an agenda. The Guardian spreads misinformation about the climate just about every single day, and they've been doing that for many years. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on these scamsters for the past 13 years. You can visit him and Kyrie on the web at realclimatescience.com.